Hi guys! Alright, it was good seeing most of you on Zoom today and the day before, but I know some of us couldn't log on for whatever reason. So just want to review what we talked about in class the past couple of days. So first, we're going to be taking a look at 1984 Part 1, Chapters 4 through 5, because that was what we reviewed in class on Monday. So Chapter 4, the first question is, explain what a speakwrite is and how it works. We had talked about this before, I think, in a previous video or in class, but a speakwrite essentially is kind of like Siri. It transcribes spoken word and it puts it into print for you. Number 2, examine why the party requires history to be rewritten rather than sharing that events can change from time to time. So the party may believe that its power rests on being like the all-powerful, all-knowing kind of being in the government. So they don't want to risk anything that could jeopardize people's trust in them or their credibility and reputation. So rather than saying oops, we messed up last week when we gave you those numbers, here are the actual correct numbers, they just go ahead and change history. That way it was as if they'd always said the correct thing. Because they want citizens to feel like they can count on the party, that the party and Big Brother are always right. So there can be nothing in history that contradicts anything that is true according to them. Number 3, describe the process that Winston undertakes to change historical records. So he's one of the people that actually does change history as he's told to do. He doesn't do it on his own. He doesn't do it because he thinks it's right, but it's his job. So when he gets something that he needs to change, he requests the appropriate issue of the newspaper. He makes a new version of the story, the article, either by replacing statistics, changing the numbers, changing the outcome or a prediction that Big Brother had made. Then he takes those corrections, he clips it to the original document, gives them back to the records department, and then he puts the message to change things in the memory hole. That way it's as if he never was given that request. Number 4, what would most likely happen if a citizen of Airstrip 1 asked questions about the change in the chocolate ration or the amount of boots produced? So if they were to question anything that the party had given out to the people, they would most likely be arrested and likely be vaporized. So not a good thing. That's probably the best way that they have to control the people. They're fearful of what could happen if they spoke out, so they just choose not to. Number 5, evaluate how citizens, including family members, feel about each other. So this one, there wasn't a straight answer in the book. This was more of something that you had to analyze. But the citizens seem to have very few relationships, if any at all, with people around them. People who are in family members like Mr. and Mrs. Parsons and their children, they don't typically really love each other. They're just kind of a family unit. If you think of The Giver, for example, they didn't have any emotion in that society. They had a family unit who cared for one another, but they didn't understand the emotion of loving one another. Here it's a bit more dire, where they don't even understand what it's like to care for a person. Everyone is very detached. They're very isolated. They only care about themselves. We also see Winston with his coworkers. They've been working next to each other for several years, but he doesn't even know their names. So that just shows us how few relationships they develop in that society. And number 6, describe what happens to citizens after they are arrested. So there's a couple different things that can happen. 1, they are vaporized right away, so it's as if they never existed. Goodbye. 2, they can be released for a year or 2 before they're executed, or they might come back at a point later on in time to implicate themselves in trial after being arrested. You can find the answer for that on page 41. Just some other notes about chapter 4. Page 38, we get introduced to this new character. His name is Ampleforth. Just remember, he's going to be coming up again later on in the story. He's a poet who rewrites poetry that's considered offensive to the party, but for some reason they want to keep it around. So he basically works with propaganda and making sure that all the poems that have ever been written align with the party's values and ideology. On page 39, the Ministry of Truth's purpose is to create all forms of media for societies. That includes books, newspapers, films, plays, poems, basically anything that you can consume. But they also recreate everything that they've done there for the proles, and they do it at a much lower value or lower level of intellect, because they're considered more low class, I should say. And the last thing I want you guys to recognize is pages 41 through 42. Winston brings up this new character. His name's Comrade Ogilvy. Just keep in mind, who is he? Winston has the ability to make up a completely new person in order to rewrite history for Big Brother. So it's interesting that we look at the question, does it matter if he's made up? Like, does that change the fact that he actually never existed? Or is whatever he writes into the newspaper, is that something that is now a new truth? So he may have very well existed even though no one ever actually knew who he was. All right, so chapter 5. Number 1, we addressed this earlier in a different video, but why do the people in the party refer to each other as comrades rather than friends? This is really similar to Animal Farm, which is interesting because we see a lot of parallels between this book by George Orwell and Animal Farm, which is another book that he wrote. But comrade kind of gives off the feeling that there's no real relationship there. It's more of a coworker or an acquaintance rather than having that emotional attachment of a friend. It's also a word that you use like in a militaristic society, so that kind of just gives more of that feeling that that's the kind of world that they live in. Number 2, we meet another character. His name is Syme. How is Syme's opinion of the hanging different from Winston's opinion? So Syme enjoys the hanging. He describes the gruesome details and he kind of finds pleasure in watching them. He's very sadistic if you think of it like that. Whereas Winston, on the other hand, shies away from the hangings. He doesn't really want to have anything to do with those because he finds them violent and repulsive. Number 3, explain how Newspeak hopes to eradicate all thought crime. So Newspeak, the purpose of that, and Syme works to do this, is to delete as many words as possible. That way they get the vocabulary from like being super extensive to being just very, very basic to just a few words. So by eliminating vocabulary and getting rid of like nouns, verbs, adjectives, people in this world will no longer be able to truly express how they're feeling because they just won't have the intellect to do so. So since they're eliminating all words and things that they can think of, you're eliminating thought crime because they can't actually think about anything against the government anymore. Number 4, evaluate how Parsons' children's actions reflect their society's attitude towards differences or towards people who are different or foreigners. So here we see Parsons give the example of how his children followed a man who was different because he had different types of shoes on. He wasn't necessarily doing anything wrong. He was just taking a stroll, but he looked different, so they followed him because of that. People in their society, especially children, are trained to look out for people who are different and look at different like flaws or any potential mistake that they can make and capture them for. It's kind of like I gave this example. If you're driving and you're like, following the law, doing everything you're supposed to be doing, using your signal, stopping at a stop sign, that kind of thing. But once a policeman gets behind you, do you get a little nervous? You get like a little paranoid. You kind of start watching yourself a little bit more. That's kind of how the foreigners feel in this society. They constantly feel like they're being watched and like someone's always looking for them to mess up. All right, and the last one for chapter 5, let's give an example of face crime. So face crime is basically any facial expression, whether you mean to make it or you just make it subconsciously, that looks like it could be you're thinking something against the government. Page 54 gives you guys all these great examples. It can be like a nervous tic. It can be like if you look anxious for some reason, you could be muttering to yourself. If they're announcing something positive about the economy, but you have like a grim look on your face, even if you don't mean it, that would be considered face crime. So just some other notes from chapter 5 on page 46. Syme's telling Winston all about the destruction of words and Newspeak and how they're making it so much better for everyone. And he credits Big Brother with this idea. I just found it interesting because there's another parallel between this book and Animal Farm, where in Animal Farm, every victory and everything that was good that happened was credited to Napoleon. So even if the citizens are doing all the work, they're the ones helping make progress, all glory goes to either Napoleon in Animal Farm or Big Brother in 1984. Page 46, I just found it ironic that Syme calls Old Speak full of vague and useless shades of meaning, when in reality Old Speak offers so much more specificity, it's so much more specific, we'll just go with that, in meaning and in tone. Let's take a look at page 47. Why does Winston think that Syme will be vaporized? Syme seems to be like one of the most loyal members of the party, but he's too smart for his own good. Even if he believes in Big Brother fully, he's all about the party, he's still too intelligent and he doesn't know when to kind of shut his mouth and stop talking. So that could potentially get him vaporized. And the last thing, just another piece of irony on page 53, Parsons is celebrating the Ministry of Plenty for doing a great job this year. They've just heard about all the great economic improvements, the overproduction of goods, that kind of thing. But then he asks Winston if Winston has any extra razor blades that he could spare. Think about the irony in that. If things are supposed to be really good, there was an overproduction, would he be asking someone for razor blades? Probably not. He'd be able to go purchase them himself. Alright, so that's all I've got for chapters 4 and 5 of part 1. The next video will be about chapters 6 and 7. So I'll see you in a minute.